Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at trench warfare. This video will provide some background knowledge or context for the rest of your studies while we're looking at this source inquiry. We'll also introduce ourselves to the type of sources that are available when studying the Western Front. Anyway, let's get into it. When understanding why World War I descended into a process of trench warfare, it's important first of all to realise that this was not how people expected the war to be fought. The Schlieffen Plan of 1905, which the Germans prepared in advance of the war, gives us some clues. Here, in very basic terms, we can see the German plan. Notice that the French are in forts on the border with Alsace-Lorraine, which Germany won from the French in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The German plan was to bypass these defences by going through neutral Belgium. First, it was presumed that the Belgians would let the Germans through, being unable to put up any resistance, or that if they did put up resistance, it would be so little that the German army would go through anyway. That way, the German army could march through Belgium, outflank the French defences and surround Paris, then winning the war. At least that was the plan. However, the reality of what happened in 1914 showed that this didn't actually work, and that's what explains why the trench warfare happened at all. So what really happened? Why did the Schlieffen Plan fail? Firstly, you may notice some other symbols on here which weren't in the previous one. For example, we have the British Expeditionary Force in the southeast of England there, and we have French mobile reserves in and around Paris. But let's not forget as well the bravery of the small Belgian army. So in very, very basic terms, and I really am simplifying here, the German army went to go through Belgium and were delayed by much more fierce Belgian resistance than anyone had expected. This provided a bit of time for the British Expeditionary Force to get across the Channel and also delay the Germans too. So that's where we see the race to the sea, with the Germans attempting to outflank the Belgians and the British and failing to do so. So in this race to the sea, the armies rushed north trying to outflank each other until they reached the Channel, and even the best soldiers in the world couldn't wade through the English Channel. The rest of the German force went towards Paris as expected, but they were stopped by the French army at the Battle of the Marne and indeed pushed back somewhat. So here France stopped the German army northwest of Paris and on the River Marne, but both sides suffered terrible losses in this fight. And so eventually a process of trench warfare developed with a stalemate, with neither side able to outflank the other. So they dug in, protection against the terrible and devastating defensive weapons of the age. So by the end of the summer of 1914, you get this stalemate. Both sides have dug in and nobody can break through. So what was a trench like? This diagram helps us to understand the basic structure of a trench. Each side quickly discovered that they could not overpower their enemies, so they began to dig in for cover. Very quickly, lines of trenches developed, stretching all the way from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. This diagram shows a typical frontline trench, particularly in a British trench. These tend to be fairly basic in comparison to some of the more complicated French defences and particularly the German trenches. This was arranged into a system though. Each side built networks of trenches to provide deeper defences and to support the soldiers in the front line. This diagram which I've drawn is not to scale, but it gives you an idea of the layout. Here we can see the typical front line trench nearest the enemy. Notice the sharp corners. These would help bomb blasts that landed inside the trench and stop them going all the way along the trench, providing devastation, but also they made them harder to fight their way along, with invading enemies having to fight for every corner. Then behind that we have the command trench, which is about 20 metres behind the front line trench. And then we have the communications trenches, which are joining them up. Lastly, we have the support trench at the back. This might be as much as 200 metres behind the line. This would contain the headquarters, reserve troops, latrines, and crucially for our studies, a dressing station. So how do people know about these? Well, spotter planes could fly overhead and take photographs. So it was easy to see troop build-ups and movements as well. Trench lines being fixed meant that artillery could be zeroed in on them very effectively and really quite easily, and so they were being constantly pounded by artillery before attacks, and there was always the risk of artillery even when attacks weren't imminent. So pretty miserable places to be. This leads us on to consider the conditions in the trenches. Much of World War I was characterised by this trench warfare with static, strong defences on both sides. However, it's a bit of a myth that soldiers spent all of their time in the trenches. Soldiers spent only about 15% of their time in the front line, and rarely longer than a week at that. 40% of their time in command or support trenches behind the line, and 45% of their time behind the lines. So again, when we consider where soldiers were actually being based, they're not in the frontline trenches quite as much as you'd think. But there were significant dangers, but also health risks that came along with this. Finding out about the health risks and dangers that soldiers faced in the First World War will rely on interrogating sources in this module. All knowledge of the past relies on sources. A selection of types of sources is shown below. In the source investigation, you will be expected to identify the types of sources that you're dealing with, be able to explain what makes them useful, and be able to select types of sources that you would suggest for further investigation. Let's have a bit of practice of that. So here is our surviving evidence of the past. These are divided broadly between written sources, oral or spoken sources, and non-written sources. In terms of written sources, you get private sources which aren't expected to be read, things like private letters and diaries. You get official government sources which are expected to be read, things like government records, records of meetings, government directives, that sort of thing. And you get unofficial sources such as newspapers. In terms of oral sources, well, they've mostly dried up now because everyone who fought in the First World War is now sadly dead, but then it was over 100 years ago. However, many of them were around when it was still possible to record such interviews, and so we do have much better oral and spoken sources about the First World War than earlier conflicts. There are then also many non-written sources. These might include archaeology, things that have been dug up, things that can be seen in the landscape, surviving buildings and artefacts. What you could do here is you could pause the video and see if you can link these different types of sources to the diagram above. What type of source is it? And bear in mind, it might be more than one. If you're going to do that, you can pause the video now. If not, we'll go through the answers. So people's diaries, well, they would be written and private. Pieces of bomb shrapnel would be non-written artefacts. The diary of a government minister might seem private, but government ministers sort of understand that their diary is going to be read one day, so that would be a written source and it would be official. A photograph of stretcher bearers would be an artefact. Newspaper reports are unofficial written sources. Royal Army Medical Corps records are official written sources. A restored trench system, well, that would be a landscape. Records of government meetings would be written and official sources. Speaking to an eyewitness would be an oral or spoken source. Excavating a World War I medical kit, well, that would be either archaeology or artefacts. Often artefacts are the product of archaeology. A Royal Army Medical Corps training manual would be an official written source. And a map of historical locations, well, it depends how you interpret this, but it could be evidence of landscape, but it could also be evidence of artefacts. A TV interview with a World War I soldier, and there were several of them in the 1960s and 70s especially, would be an oral or spoken source. And a former base hospital would be an example of a surviving building. We can apply that to real sources too. Source A shows stretcher bearers trying to cross no man's land near Ypres with thick mud and flooded shell holes. That can provide us with quite a lot of information, but we can use it in combination with other things too. Source B shows Scots stretcher bearers trying to help a man through a crowded trench. You get a sense of some of the difficulties of doing this. And source C, a description of travelling through trenches by a British soldier. Here, let's have a look at what it said. Although people talk about communications trenches and duckboards, they generally weren't there. And if they were, there was every probability that the enemy were going to shell them. So going along a trench at night meant stumbling along a dark, wet ditch with an irregular floor and a right-angled turn every few yards, so that you can't see where you're going. To manoeuvre these things, heavy bundles of barbed wire, round a corner was so fatiguing it can hardly be described. So you'd go cursing and stumbling along in the dark, slipping into holes and stumbling over wires. Worst of all was the traffic problem, because there would be several parties of this kind going through the labyrinth of trenches, and you could have a jam as bad as a London traffic jam. So let's have a think. Which of the sources, source A or source B, best backs up source C? Well, both of them show the difficulties of movement, but actually if we look at source B, it does corroborate or back up many of the things that source C is saying about the conditions in the trenches. So you can imagine how difficult it would have been. All of this adds up to make caring for the soldiers' health and well-being within the trenches tremendously difficult. The power of defensive weapons in World War I resulted in a stalemate, with both sides digging trenches to hold the line. Trench warfare was muddy, uncomfortable, and led to disease as well as danger. The biggest danger, day to day, was artillery. Bear in mind that historians rely on a variety of evidence to learn about the past, and these types of evidence are sources. Different sources are suitable for different inquiries. They have different features that can make them useful, or they may have limitations to their usefulness. But remember that all sources are useful when they are used critically and appropriately for the right inquiry. That's the end of this first in the series of rapid revision videos about medicine in the trenches of the First World War. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please drop the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more. But for now, I'll say goodbye.